Please be advised that the following clergy conversation begins with a presentation from a Citadel professor of criminal justice and counterterrorism on anti-governmental movements, Christian identity movements, and white nationalist movements. The slides shown and the content discussed may be disturbing and even triggering to some.
Hi, my name is Adam Shoemaker, and I'm rector here at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Charleston, welcoming you to this month's clergy conversation. And our clergy team is very happy to have with us today Dr. Matthew Zommer, who is an associate professor and department head of criminal justice at the Citadel, who teaches international crime and counterterrorism. And just that title, friends, should signal to you that this will be an intense conversation, but we clergy believe an important one to acknowledge the threats that we face and what is going on right now in light of the siege of Capitol Hill and the movements that participated in that siege. I also want to acknowledge something that I said in a sermon over the summer, that I do believe as Christians, we are called to be political, not partisan, but political, meaning at its most basic level, we Christians are called to be engaged with what is going on in the world, good, bad, and indifferent, and to be honest about what is going on in the world. And I think that Matthew's presence is going to help us to do that. Matthew's going to give us some background on anti-government movements. We'll have some reaction and some conversation, and then Matthew will have to sign off because of his schedule at the Citadel, and we'll have some dialogue about the dangers of intertwining Christianity with nationalism and patriotism, and also some reflection on what our call is as Christians, as individuals, and as a church, given where we find ourselves. So Matthew, thank you so much for being with us, and you can go into your presentation now.
Thank you very much, Adam. I've been teaching comparative counterterrorism for about 7-8 years now at the Citadel, and my master's degree is actually in forensic psychology, and part of what I examined was the private militia movement and the entire rhetoric of apocalyptic violence. And up to about 3 or 4 years ago, when I taught my courses, it was mostly on Islamic radicalization. With the change in our executive branch 4 years ago, the far right became more prevalent. And now I find myself, when I teach my comparative counterterrorism class, having to compare the far right movement in the United States to what's happening in Europe, particularly Germany and France. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is really the modern origin of 3 movements: the anti-government movement, the Christian identity movement, and the white nationalist movement. And I'm going to share screen with a short PowerPoint that I created yesterday. Adam did not give me a lot of notice on this, so please excuse the, can you guys see it?
Yes.
Perfect,
Yes.
Perfect. So we're looking at the modern origin of 3 movements. So the first slide, really, we're looking at the 1970s. So get the Ku Klux Klan out of the picture here. We're looking at 2 movements that really started to gain traction in the early 1970s. The first is the neo-Nazi movement. That is something that we're all familiar with. We're familiar with the imagery, and it really focuses on this almost fetishization of Nazi symbolism. Now, something that also occurred in the 1970s that was certainly more underground was the Christian identity movement. And it's really based on this elaborate justification that grew out of this 19th century, I guess you'd call it religious conspiracy theory, which claimed that white Europeans, Anglo-Saxons, not Jews, are the true Israelites favored by God in the Bible. They are, in fact, the lost tribe of Israel. Now, this is very different, a different type of millennialism, I would say, than what we see happening with the more, I would say, the Protestant or evangelical millennialism that we see. And that is because the Christian identity movement does not believe in this pre-tribulation rapture. And we oftentimes think about the evangelical Protestants as believing in millennialism. Yes, we're living in the end of days, but they have this view of this before Jesus arrives rapture happening. Now, the Christian identity movement does not buy into that. They don't believe that. Now, this has implications because they don't believe in this pre-tribulation rapture. They don't trust secular institutions, including the military. So that is why you're going to see this almost blending of the Christian identity movement with the private militia movement. Now, both the neo-Nazi movement and the Christian identity movement have this strong thread of anti-Semitism, but really their anger is focused on all non-white people. Now, something that grew out of the neo-Nazi movement was the National Alliance. And this is very critical to understand, kind of like one of the splits that occurred within the American Nazi Party. And to do that, you have to look at an individual called William Luther Pierce, PhD in physics, I believe, tenured professor in University of Colorado. He split with the American Nazi Party in the early 1970s and created the National Alliance. And he did so really from a marketing perspective. He was quite good at marketing his racist attitude in that he got rid of the Nazi symbolism. He got rid of the pageantry, the goose stepping, the waving of the swastika. And he was really trying to focus on appealing to broader audiences. Now, the quote that I cut and pasted from the Southern Poverty Law Center really says it. The National Alliance was for decades the most dangerous and best organized neo-Nazi formation in the US. And in particular, one thing they were really good at was creating propaganda. Now, the National Alliance slowly dissolved after Pierce's death in 2002. But one of the, call it brilliant marketing, but one of the propaganda products that the National Alliance created and that William Luther Pierce wrote is a very important book called The Turner Diaries. Pierce, published it under a pseudonym. It was published under the National Alliance's publishing arm. They had their own publishing arm, the National Vanguard Press. And it since has been republished. I have a copy of it over there, but it's been published since by other booksellers, and you can get the PDF online. I don't really recommend it. It's a poorly written piece of racist propaganda. But it really is a manifesto for anti-government and white nationalist supporters. And the book takes this form of a fictional diary, and it describes a racist vision of the United States in which something called the system, which is controlled by African Americans, enforces Jewish politicians' policy to confiscate all guns in America. It's a dystopian novel, and it's about the United States where non-white minorities have disarmed and oppressed white Americans. And this leads to an armed white nationalist revolution. Now, part of the Turner Diaries is the creation of this, you can call it guerrilla terrorist cell called The Order. And the book follows The Order as it launches a series of terrorist attacks, eventually blossoming into a full-blown insurgency. And in the end, the Order wins, and they embark on a campaign of worldwide genocide against non-whites. This book is pivotal to understand the influence that the anti-government aspect has on this. So what happened is this book inspired a real life The Order. And this is kind of like it's an interesting chapter in the story because we see members of the Order, a real terrorist organization, terrorist cell created and went inactive in 1983, almost blend together white nationalism of the National Alliance with this Christian identity hybrid. Members of the Order were inspired by the Turner Diary. They called it their Bible. And in 1983, they went on a rampage across, I think it was around Washington, Oregon, ended up in the Midwest, where they, killed 3 people. They stole millions of dollars and distributed it to white nationalist leaders. And their motto borrows from Jeremiah, and the quote is there. And their official symbol is there also. And so you do see this blending of Christian identity with white nationalism. Now, they were short-lived. They didn't last long. The gang was busted. The cell was broken up. But it's important because one of the members, David Lane, while sitting in prison, wrote a manifesto called the White Genocide Manifesto. And when he was in prison, he later distilled his views into a one sentence statement that is now simply known by extremists as the 14 words. And you'll hear this being chanted. It's a motto. It's almost like a mantra among white nationalists. And we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. I think that's 14 words. I've actually never counted them, but it's highly influential. And even though these words were written in the 1980s, we still see it influential today, and not just in the United States. Anders Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist, quoted those words and read the Turner Diaries. And in 2019, the Christchurch massacre that happened, the killer wrote on his gun the number 14. So we see this almost blending of white nationalism and this Christian identity hybrid with the Order. The second influence of the Turner Diaries, and this is the one that it's very well known, is the Turner Diaries' influence on Timothy McVeigh. And this is where we really see the anti-government theme realized in the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. And it's important to examine the variables that led to McVeigh's radicalization. And when we look at McVeigh's bio, oftentimes it's overlooked that he saw combat in the 1990-1991 Gulf War. He was awarded the Bronze Star. He was a 20 millimeter gunner on a Bradley fighting vehicle and saw combat. And he wrote and said in interviews after his arrest that he went to the Gulf War really like pumped up with a national pride, of course, because he serves in the military. And as the chain gunner on a 20 millimeter, he talked about literally cutting people in half, cutting Iraqi soldiers in half. And he became desensitized to that and disillusioned. So I think there is a PTSD variable here in that he became desensitized to killing, but he also became disillusioned by the United States and their foreign policy. So that is really where we see this seed of anti-government being planted. Now, when he got back home, he was actually kicked out of the military for like a physical, he couldn't pass a physical exam, or he got, he didn't pass Ranger School, I believe it was. So McVeigh comes back and he wanders around the country and he becomes inspired, radicalized by Pierce's The Turner Diaries. And he starts traveling from gun show to gun show, a hotbed for the far right, selling copies of the Turner Diaries. That's how influential it was. Now, in the early 90s, we see the far right anti-government movement increase because of two incidents. The first is the siege at Ruby Ridge, which happened in 1992. With that, we see U.S. Marshals trying to arrest a man named Randy Weaver. There is, a lot of argument that Randy Weaver was entrapped by the government, but the attempt to arrest him led to a siege and a shootout that resulted in the death of a U.S. Marshal and two members of the Weaver family. Now, conspiracy theories abound about the Ruby Ridge siege, and I can probably talk about it for an hour, so I'll spare you that. The important point to make about the siege of Ruby Ridge is that it led to a lot of public outcry, especially on the far right, about government intrusion. Now, a couple years later, or 1 year later, you have Waco, Texas, and the Branch Davidians. And this siege lasted 51 days. It was literally around the clock news. And we all know the result of that. 82 civilians and 4 federal agents were killed. And what's interesting to note about Timothy McVeigh and Waco, Texas, is that during the 51-day siege, McVeigh traveled to Waco almost as, a way to show solidarity with the Branch Davidians. And he sold anti-government bumper stickers there, and he sold copies of the Turner Diary. And so it was really the government storming of the Branch Davidians that was really, I think, the straw that broke the radicalization back, or however you want to refer to it. And at that point, he started planning the attack. And the Turner Diaries is not just a manifesto for white nationalism and the anti-government movement. It's also a how-to book. It's a how-to guide that loosely tells you how to build a nitrate fertilizer truck bomb. And with McVeigh's military training, and it breaks my heart to say this, but it's really not that difficult to build a nitrate fertilizer bomb. And he did it, and he did it from a technical perspective, very well. And when you read the Turner Diaries, there's a part where the main character blows up an FBI building. And when you read the Turner Diaries, it's literally cut and pasted to what McVeigh did in Oklahoma City. And so really, I think the anti-government movement is where we see, in the 1990s, we see that with the Turner Diaries and Timothy McVeigh. Now, what's interesting is that when I look at the far right propaganda that we've seen in the last 4 years, Timothy McVeigh is almost like the elephant in the room that nobody talks about. I imagine that many anti-government supporters would, probably go along with Timothy McVeigh, but nobody ever talks about it. And so he's really, he has not been elevated in the far right. And that could be because the nature of the victims. So many of the victims were children because the truck bomb was parked near a daycare center. And so that really is the origin of 3 separate movements we see here. White supremacy movement, the Christian identity movement, and the anti-government movement. And that kind of leads us to what happened a week ago today, last Wednesday. And we need to look at these groups and think about what they share. Now, from a technology perspective, they all coalesced under the alt-right movement. And they all have distinct apocalyptic worldviews, but they do share an apocalyptic worldview, whether it be white genocide, whether it be the tribulation, and or really a paranoia worldview of the government. And conspiracy theories abound, and entire encyclopedias could probably be written about the conspiracy theories that these groups adhere to. Um, and in the last 4 years, they have a shared demagogue in the form of Donald Trump. And if he's not considered a demagogue to them, he has at least taken something that was locked in a closet out. And the images that we saw last Wednesday and the images that we've been seeing for a couple of years now really drive home the fact that something that was underground is now above ground. Some of my concluding thoughts, a big part of what I teach is from the perspective of comparative counterterrorism is risk assessment. And that is the difficult and painful, part of trying to figure out when the next attacks will be. Will there be more attacks? And I won't, try to end on a negative note, but this is going to be something that is going to be around for a long time. It's better organized now, even with, Facebook banning different groups and Twitter, et cetera. It's just going to go more underground. We do have the dark web there also. Also, because the United States has been fighting multi-generational wars in the Middle East, we also see a lot of members of the far right coming from military backgrounds. So they do have that technological expertise, that element of training and what goes along with being in the military. Now, for future enforcement, and I'm going to end on a positive note here. The far right and anti-government movements are much easier to infiltrate than something like Islamic radicalized groups, because there's less of an ideological learning curve or cultural curve. And so the FBI or federal agencies are going to have a much easier time infiltrating these groups. So that's one plus. Now, Biden's nominee for Attorney General, Merrick Garland, he's often discussed as the failed Supreme Court nominee. However, he's also the federal prosecutor who prosecuted the Oklahoma City bombing. He's the one who prosecuted Timothy McVeigh. And I would like to think that, Garland was chosen because of his expertise in prosecuting anti-government, far-right white supremacists. And so I do think that we have that going for us. And so I'll end on that happy note, and would love to take some questions.
Thank you, Matthew. Can you take the screen off so we can all see one another again?
Is it off?
No, you think you have to close out of. There we go. One question I have from that presentation, Matthew, is the issue of de-radicalization. What literature might say about the most effective ways to try to de-radicalize people who have found themselves in that path?
Well, the de-radicalization literature that I'm familiar with is largely based on Islamic radicalization, in what countries like England have been doing to, de-radicalize. And I think that really has to do with, positive role modeling. And maybe I'm being an optimist, but I do think concerning anti-government movement in the United States, I think white supremacy is going to be different and Christian identity is going to pose certain problems also, is that positive role modeling, while at the same time trying to get a person to not think in a dichotomous view. And with all of these movements, we see this dichotomous worldview of, this or that, black or white, good or evil. And that nuanced view is important, but it's so difficult. How does one somehow instill in somebody a nuanced view? And it's almost as difficult to how do you instill into an adult who's been radicalized the concept of empathy? I don't have an answer, but I do think the issue that we face is obviously a lack of empathy, but also having a dichotomous worldview as opposed to a nuanced worldview.
Are there reactions or questions from our other clergy?
I'm interested in, do you have some data or understanding of who has been drawn to this way of thinking? I mean, you look at the pictures that you showed.
The Southern Poverty Law Center really has done a great job with, and also the Anti-Defamation League has done a great job with producing material on that. What's interesting is, the stereotype was that people that were drawn to the far right were largely uneducated people that, for the Christian identity movement came from evangelical backgrounds. But what's interesting is in the last 4 years, we've seen people from more educated or more middle class become radicalized to the far right. And so I think that it's obviously spread. And I think the demographics of who this is appealing to has also changed over time.
Why do you think they've been drawn to it?
Perhaps this is an oversimplified answer, but I think because of Donald Trump. I believe that something that was whispered about is now being shouted about out loud. And it's led to greater acceptance of behavior that 4 or 5 years ago would have just been whispered about in a room.
I wonder, Matthew, if you could talk a little bit about what happened in Charlottesville early in the Trump's tenure as president, and how that may have, would that have also really shaped and kind of maybe increased folks' understanding of this?
I mean, yes, I think what happened in Charlottesville and our government's reaction or lack thereof reaction and condemnation sent a clear message that this type of behavior is acceptable by the presidency and the executive branch. How do we take a step back from that now, though?
I'm curious, Adam mentioned de-radicalization of folks who have accepted this worldview. I'm curious if in your research, what data you found that address preventing radicalization in the first place. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking particularly about parents of pre-adolescents or adolescents who might be concerned about what kids are seeing online or seeing in the media, or just folks who are concerned about other members of their family who might be susceptible to this kind of worldview.
I think then we look at the susceptibility to radicalization, we have to look at the variables that lead to radicalization. And that's social and peer networks. That could also be with, the Christian identity movement, the religion that you're raised in. And social networking and social media is really, what we've seen with, I can speak more for Islamic radicalization than I can for far right radicalization in this matter. But when we look at what happened with ISIS, you'll see people that are in their bedrooms or in their basement watching, couple hundred hours of ISIS radicalization, propaganda, and somebody who really had no inkling towards radicalization, all of a sudden packing up and going to go fight in ISIS land. So radicalization can happen very quickly. And I think there could be, I'm not a psychologist, but there could be people that are maybe don't have a lot of friends, that don't fit in with their social or peer groups, that are more susceptible to this type of online radicalization.
I just want to close. We're going to need to transition the conversation, Matthew, but I wonder, given the work you do, the important work you do, but the intense field of study that you are in, how you try to take care of yourself as you navigate these waters.
Well, this conversation has been about far right radicalization. Another big part of what I teach is also on genocide and other aspects of what I call apocalyptic violence. I think really just having a healthy worldview, and and when you stare into the abyss, just have a perspective, have faith. And I mean, I can't really explain to you why I can do what I do without having it impact me. It does impact me, but having faith and friends and almost an objective perspective. And I don't know if this is healthy or not, maybe it isn't, but as a trained social scientist, my mantra has always been to be objective and to also look at there's always more than one variable to explain a complex phenomenon, whether it be far right radicalization, whether it be genocide. And so I think being objective and detached when I analyze these very dark, troubling aspects of human behavior has helped me, but also my faith.
Well, I think the presentation you've offered has highlighted the gifts and the grace of a church community, as well as some of the pitfalls and the things that we need to be mindful about. And that's where I'd like to turn the conversation. But before we do that, I'd like to thank Dr. Zommer for being with us. Thank you so much. And bless you in the work that you do, the important work you do.
Thank you, and have a great day.
All right, take care. Bye-bye. So in light of what Matthew's presentation focused on, I'd like to spend some time reflecting with all of you on the dangers of intertwining Christianity with white supremacy, as well as nationalism or even patriotism, and want to get everyone's thoughts and perspective on that. I will begin by saying that this question, this wondering, is why I know many clergy often wrestle with putting national symbols in worship spaces like American flags. I think sometimes that is done without a lot of thought for the way in which, if we're not careful, we can almost make the flag a symbol of worship and begin to limit the realm of God to just one set of people and one country and to our own national interests, instead of something that is much bigger and broader than that. And so that's just an initial thought that I think we can do our Christian witness great damage when we do things that make people feel like, well, to be American is to be Christian. And I think that limits what we're talking about in a significant way when we're trying to talk about the Christian gospel in the church. Other thoughts?
When you said that, I had the feeling or the thought process of allegiance. I pledge my allegiance to the flag. And in that statement, there's a deep confliction or a question. Where is my allegiance? As a Christian, our true allegiance is only to Christ. And so we need to, as you said, our symbols go from the flag to the cross. And in that, the debates that we're having today are really not at their heart a debate about politics. It should be a debate about the gospel and how we are choosing to live out our lives in community. So much of what we're talking about earlier in the discussion were about individuals. And Christianity at its heart is showing us a way that we can live in community.
Thank you, Greg. I think that point about allegiance is really important, and really gets at the heart of the issue as well. You know, to be a Christian first, full stop, should inform and guide our thinking. Whether we're an American citizen or a citizen of another country, ultimately, you know, we would say that our citizenship, our ultimate citizenship, is in heaven, and that should guide and govern our actions and our thinking and the way we engage in the political realm.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking a lot from his presentation about just the power of words and the power of language. What he presented about the Turner Diaries just hit me to my core. And thinking about how those words that person wrote, you can trace that through line that has led to so much death and destruction, you know, and it started with those words. And so the words that we choose to use, the symbols we choose to use, really matter. You know, that old rhyme about sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt me. That is wrong. That is wrong. Our words matter. And we know this from our faith. You know, we know that Jesus is the word, that God spoke and then things came into being. I mean, that's part of the language that we use in our faith. So I'm reflecting on the way that we use words in community as a Christian community. I think that's so much more important than perhaps any of us realize. And I'm also thinking about the words that I use as an individual Christian, especially if I'm not having a one-on-one conversation with someone, especially what I choose to put out into the public sphere, into social media, that I think those matter far more than I ever realized. So I'm going to do some personal reflection, and I just invite everyone else to as well. Of what are your words saying? Are they contributing to love and to healing and to God's work in the world? Or are they contributing to further division and further pain and further injury to God's children?
In the last few days, as we're watching TV, the debate has all been around what was Trump really saying? What do his words mean? And you know, he said things like, "You can't win this by being weak. You can only win this by fighting and being strong." And then when we watched where the people went and what they did after hearing those words, I say his words really did mean something.
Well, and I also think it is really important in what Laura said, that we acknowledge that social media, which is not going away, is increasingly becoming an important part of the public square, for good or for ill. You have billions of people around the world who are engaged on it. It can be used to make the world smaller, to bring us together. It's enabled me to remain in touch with family and friends all over the world. It enables churches like ours to have a mouthpiece, but it can be used as a means of radicalization. And the social media has emerged so quickly that I don't think we've caught up as a church in thinking about the ethics and the morality of how we are called to engage as Christians in that public square. And I think that's an important thing for all of us as individuals and as the church to think about, is how we navigate our way through social media, which again is not, the genie's out of the bottle. I mean, it's not going anywhere. It will be a reality, I would imagine, certainly for all of our lifetimes. And it's something that we need to be really thoughtful about and prayerful about.
And as you say that, Adam, what I think is interesting about conversations like these are using social media as a way to have a deeper conversation, right? Often social media can be a simple image or an article that we can scroll through, very short, brief. And I think what we're trying to do here is acknowledge that we are all still learning. I mean, I think part of what Matthew discussed, were new things for me and hard to hear. We are all processing this in real time. We are all trying to find our way. And yet, by having these open conversations here, it's also inviting us into dialogue with one another, but also encouraging not only myself, but our community to reflect on the way of love. And, I listened to Bishop Curry's message that we had in the sermon on Sunday again this morning. And I think, Greg, what you were talking about as far as being a community and encouraging each other in the way of Jesus's love is ultimately what we are called to do right now. But I think trying to use social media in a way to go deeper and to say, we too, or I too am struggling and trying to find my way, but ultimately my allegiance is to Jesus Christ. And ultimately I commit myself to walking the way of love and trying to do that each and every day. And I know as a community, St. Stephen's is trying to do and committing ourselves to do just that.
Well, and getting into the way of love, I think that our presiding bishop has really made the centerpiece of his tenure as the head of our church, is a good way to transition to our call as individuals and as a church moving forward. But I do want to say very explicitly before we move on, because I believe it can't be said too often that white supremacy or any ideology that puts one group of people over and above others is sin and is a distortion of the Christian gospel that we were reminded of in our gospel on Sunday when we hear the story of Jesus's baptism. Jesus comes up out of the waters of the Jordan and is proclaimed as God's beloved son. And I believe that all of us are beloved by God. God says to each of us, "You are my beloved son, you are my beloved daughter. In you I am well pleased." That's who we are. And I believe an important part of our call is to live like that and to work to create a world where there are no insiders or outsiders. No one person is superior to another. We're all part of the same human family. And so, denouncing white supremacy or any other ideology like it, I think is so important for us as a church and as leaders of a way that has been perverted. Clearly, Matthew's presentation shows that. I mean, there has been a perversion of the Christian message, the Christian gospel, that has tragically led to some of the things we heard about earlier. And we need to, I think, be honest about that. And I think honesty and speaking the truth in community across our differences in love is, I think, really important. And Courtney referenced the presiding bishop's sermon that was part of our worship service on Sunday. And I have the text of that sermon in front of me. And I want to read a short portion of the sermon. Towards the end of the sermon, Bishop Curry emphasizes that the way of love is not sentimental. And he says, remember truth and reconciliation, referring to what happened in South Africa. They had to face painful truths. They had to do what was just and what was merciful. They had to do what the prophet Micah said, that the motivation and the guide was love. And then Bishop Curry quotes Archbishop Tutu, who once said this: love, forgiving, and being reconciled to our enemies or our loved ones is not about pretending that things are other than they are. It is not about patting one another on the back or turning a blind eye to the wrong. True reconciliation exposes the awfulness of the abuse, the hurt, the truth. It could even sometimes make things worse for a while. It is a risky undertaking, but in the end, it is worthwhile, because in the end, only an honest confrontation with reality can bring forth real healing. Superficial reconciliation only brings superficial healing. And I think that's so important because for me, I believe that, speaking the truth is going to be an important ingredient to trying to ultimately bring people together. And as Desmond Tutu says, I mean, speaking the truth can be hard because in the short term, it can create tension. But I believe our tradition would teach us that ultimately is what's going to enable us to move forward as a human family. And I think we live in a social media driven world of mistruths that I think it's all the more important that we find ways to do that in Christian community together. So that's an opening comment on the thought of what is our call as Christians, as individuals in a church, as a church in this moment. Other thoughts?
Well, as we as Christians try and realize the ultimate truth, which we have found of seeing that truth being lived out through the teachings of Christ. So if that is the filter that we are choosing to look at the world, rather than only to the lenses, say, of politics, then through the Christian lens, we can begin with, as we talk about white power or supremacy, that one of the untruths is that white people are the norm and everything else is not. Well, that, if we look at it through the Christian lens, how could that possibly be? God made all of us in his image. And so as we listen to politicians or we read things or listen to the news, if we choose to look at what's being reported or printed or said through the Christian lens, we can immediately take that and say, that's not true. I know that's not true because that was not in the teachings that we are living within. The big problem in my way I'm seeing is today, and as Kurt said, we're all evolving, we're all trying to learn, is that white supremacy is nothing more than unearned advantages. Things that we've given to ourselves as white people because everybody else is different. We have placed ourselves in an advantaged way. And so when the day starts, I'm always ahead of everybody else. in the terms of the systems that I've set up, the institutions. I'm always at the advantage of those, and everybody else is trying to catch up to me. And as we look at this through the Christian lens, it couldn't be true. I mean, it is true. I'm saying we look at it as a untruth, because that is not in the teachings of Christ. We talked about community. We can think about the thinking of that community that is part of it.
Other thoughts on our call in this moment?
I'm thinking about the fine line between proclaiming the truth, because yes, the fact that white supremacy is a sin, I will plant my flag there and say that is a truth, that white supremacy is evil and wrong. And I think at the same time, if we take that same attitude towards all of our opinions in life, then I think we run the risk, we become, I think, susceptible to that kind of radicalization if we always think that we're right. So there are some things that we're taught by our faith that Jesus is very clear on, that like white supremacy is sinful, that I think we can say absolutely. But in so many of these other conversations that we have with people, I think there's a line too of saying, maybe I have something to learn here. It might not be that they're right and I should accept it, but maybe there's something that this person could teach me. Maybe we could discover something true together. Maybe I can learn and grow. Maybe what I thought was true about some subject before, maybe that will be uncovered a little bit. I think about the idea that the Holy Spirit is constantly speaking and constantly at work in the world. I know the Holy Spirit has been at work in my life, where I've been learning more and more about God's dream for the world, the older I've gotten and the further I've progressed in my faith. So I think just as much as we need to repudiate evil in the strongest possible terms, I think one of our calls at this moment is also to be open to the fact that we are still learning and growing, and that we can do that together. And together, hopefully, we can start to discern more and more the most loving and hopeful and beneficial way forward. Social media, I think, works really well in the one realm where we can make very strong claims. I think it often doesn't allow, as Courtney said, for some of those more nuanced discussions. So perhaps one of our calls is to try to put ourselves as much as we can during times of pandemic into places where we can have some more of those discussions kind of one-on-one or with small groups where we're seeking the truth together.
Yeah, I mean, I think humility is an important value for us to lift up in this time. I mean, I think mistruths, I'm talking about verifiable, like that happened right there and it's on tape, and things that shouldn't be debated because you could show somebody that happened. That isn't necessarily a matter of opinion, but obviously, I think when we are in communion and conversation with one another, there needs to be an openness and a willingness to the other, and a belief, because of what we celebrate during the Christmas season, that there's something of God in every man, woman, and child, and we need one another. We need to be in community to better approximate God's truth. And no doubt, social media does not help in that. And it is a challenge during the pandemic to figure out how we are able to be in that kind of more incarnational space where we're able to be humble and loving with one another. I think that also has exacerbated the tensions, no doubt, and the problems that we're dealing with. right now. I also, along the lines of what you said, Laura, I mean, want to say that as our president-elect has said, you know, even though there was a massive crowd that sieged the Capitol, in the grand scheme of things, that is nowhere near 75 million Americans who decided to pull the lever for Donald Trump in the November election. And you know, I think it's also got to be about not demonizing, you know, 80 million of our fellow citizens, but perhaps at the same time acknowledging, as Matthew said in his presentation, that whether that's something you support or not, there's been rhetoric over the last 4 or 5 years that has, whether that was the intention or not, has opened the door to and given oxygen and comfort to groups of people that have perverted the Christian gospel, that do espouse the sin of white supremacy, that are part of these anti-government movements, that were an important part of the leadership of what happened last week on Capitol Hill.
And that goes back to what you were saying, Laura. I mean, I truly believe in that 70 million people. Most of them wouldn't have done what happened at the Capitol. But there is something that resonates within them in terms of connecting them with what Trump has done. They need something. And if we can learn from them what that is, you know, that can begin to move us towards creating a better community. I think listening at this point is the best thing that we all need to do, in creating a transformed community. One of the problems is in the Christian thinking amongst this is so paradoxical, because everybody wants to get their point through using power, you know, power of the word, power of the pen, power in other ways. But that's paradoxically not true with Christian thinking, because it's not power, but serving and self-giving and peace and respect and love and transformation. Those aren't the things that seem to win the debate. And so we need to learn how those things enter into this world.
Do you have any thoughts, Courtney?
I will be very honest in that this everything that has happened over these past weeks has been very overwhelming, and I feel anxious for the days ahead. And yet I also appreciated Matthew's comments about his faith, and how even in the midst of all that he studies and teaches, that ultimately he finds hope in his faith. And I, like so many, have had instances in my life of darkness, and our country has as well. And yet we have found ways to move forward. And I believe that we are at a period in which there is obviously anxiety, concern, and fear. And yet I hold on to hope that there are so many who are working for a new day and a different world in which we are engaged and respectful, and in which we can disagree and yet live in peace. And so I am just at that place of prayer and trying to find the peace within myself, while also, especially with young children, living in hope for what will be coming in the days and months ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just close on that with a conversation that I was able to have with LaVonda Brown the other day, who is the executive director of the YWCA and the coordinator of our city's MLK observances. You know, as we go into this weekend, we'll be celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. King, an important saint of the church for us to pay attention to in this moment. And I was asking LaVonda about that legacy of Dr. King's and what it has to teach us, or how it can speak to where we find ourselves after the siege of the Capitol. And, you know, LaVonda, in her answer to me, really shifted to a message of hope about younger people and a younger generation that she feels inspired by, and feels in many ways like what we've seen over the last year, as hard as this year has been an emergence of a civil rights movement that she feels perhaps is most indicative of the movement that Dr. King led. And she feels hopeful about the leadership that they will bring to the church and to the world moving forward. And she also acknowledges that those of us who don't count ourselves youth, have our own work to do in this moment as well. But I think that's a hopeful message. And obviously, as a church community, we need to take care of one another and to remain in prayer. And friends, I'm going to close us in prayer, but I bid your prayers for our nation, for a peaceful transition of power, for the human family. And I do want to remind you that every evening at 7 p.m. via Zoom, we continue to hold a virtual prayer space to offer Compline, which is the good night prayer of the church from the Book of Common Prayer. We're offering that each evening at 7 p.m. through Inauguration Day, and the leadership is rotated amongst this 4-member clergy team. If you need the link to get on that Zoom call, just reach out to Amanda in our office. And with that, I'll close us by offering a prayer for the human family, which can be found on page 815 in the Book of Common Prayer. Let us pray. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for listening in to this conversation. In many ways, a hard conversation, but I believe an important one. Thank you to our clergy team for your thoughts, and let's all stay in prayer with one another. And we'll be back next month for another edition of our clergy conversation. In the meantime, be safe, friends, be well, wear your mask, and you keep the faith. Take care. Bye-bye.